Margaret Maggie Thompson had always been different from other women her age. At 72 years old, while most of her friends spent their days playing bridge, watching television, or complaining about their aching joints, Maggie could be found at the local gym lifting weights that would make men half her age think twice. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered hands told the story of a life lived without fear. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday in Coronado, California. Maggie had driven her old pickup truck to the beach for her daily 5-mile run along the shoreline. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before her as she laced up her worn running shoes, the same pair she had been using for the past 3 years. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. As she began her run, Maggie noticed unusual activity near the naval base. Groups of young men in military uniforms were setting up what looked like an obstacle course on the beach. Heavy logs, ropes, and various pieces of equipment were being arranged in precise formations. The men moved with purpose and discipline, their voices carrying across the morning air as they shouted instructions to each other. Maggie had lived in Coronado for 15 years, ever since her husband Robert had passed away from cancer. She knew this was Navy SEAL training territory, but she had never seen them practice this close to the public beach area. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she slowed her pace to observe what they were doing. The obstacle course looked intimidating even from a distance. There were rope climbs that seemed to reach toward the clouds, heavy logs that required multiple people to lift, and a series of walls that looked impossible to scale. The young SEALs were preparing for what appeared to be a grueling training session. Commander Jake Mitchell, a 38-year-old SEAL instructor with 15 years of military experience, was overseeing the setup. He had trained thousands of soldiers over his career and took pride in pushing even the strongest men to their absolute limits. His reputation for being tough but fair had earned him respect throughout the naval community. As Maggie continued her run, she found herself circling back toward the training area. Something about the challenge of the obstacles fascinated her. She had always been drawn to physical challenges, even as a child growing up on a farm in Nebraska. Her father had taught her that strength came not from size or age, but from determination and heart. The SEALs began their training session just as Maggie completed her 5th mile. She stopped at a nearby bench to stretch, positioning herself where she could watch the action unfold. The young men attacked the obstacles with impressive skill and strength, but she noticed that even some of these elite soldiers struggled with certain elements of the course. One particular obstacle caught her attention. It was a rope climb that required participants to use only their arms to pull themselves up a 20-foot length of thick rope. Several of the SEALs had failed to complete it on their first attempt, their muscles burning from the effort. The exercise looked familiar to Maggie, reminding her of her childhood days climbing the old oak tree in her family's backyard. Commander Mitchell noticed the elderly woman watching their training. At first, he thought nothing of it. Civilians often stopped to observe SEAL training from a distance. But something about this particular woman intrigued him. Unlike most spectators who seemed intimidated or amazed by the physical demands of the training, she appeared to be studying the techniques, analyzing the movements of his men. After an hour of intense training, Commander Mitchell called for a water break. The SEALs gathered around their equipment, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from their faces despite the cool morning air. It was then that Maggie did something completely unexpected. She approached the group with steady, confident steps. Her running clothes were modest but practical, and her posture showed none of the frailty typically associated with someone her age. The young SEALs looked up in surprise as this grandmother figure walked directly toward their instructor. "Excuse me," Maggie said in a clear, strong voice that carried across the beach. "I've been watching your training, and I was wondering about that rope climb over there." Commander Mitchell raised an eyebrow, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Ma'am, this is a restricted training area. I'm going to have to ask you to maintain your distance from our equipment." Maggie smiled, a twinkle in her bright blue eyes. "Oh, I'm not trying to interfere with your training, young man. I was just curious about the technique. You see, I used to do quite a bit of rope climbing myself, back in my younger days." Some of the SEALs exchanged glances, amused by the idea of this elderly woman claiming experience with rope climbing. A few of them struggled to suppress smiles, thinking this was just another case of a civilian trying to relate to their elite training. "That's interesting, ma'am," Commander Mitchell replied diplomatically. "Rope climbing is indeed a fundamental part of our physical conditioning. It requires significant upper body strength and technique." Maggie nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed some of your men were having trouble with it. The key is in the leg positioning and the rhythm of the climb. Most people try to muscle their way up using only their arms, but that's not efficient." Now the SEALs were paying closer attention. This wasn't the typical admiring commentary they usually heard from civilians. This woman was actually critiquing their technique. Petty Officer Sarah Chun, one of the few female SEALs in the group, stepped forward. She had successfully completed the rope climb, but had noticed some of her male colleagues struggling with it. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that rope climb is designed to test the limits of human physical capability. It's not something that can be completed with just technique alone." Maggie's smile widened. "Oh, my dear, I don't disagree that it requires strength. But strength comes in many forms, and sometimes experience can compensate for what youth and size provide." The comment hung in the air for a moment. Commander Mitchell could sense that his team was becoming both amused and slightly irritated by this woman's apparent confidence in discussing their elite training methods. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest in our training," he said, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "But this equipment is specifically designed for Navy SEALs. It's extremely dangerous and requires years of conditioning to attempt safely." Maggie looked directly at him, her expression serious but not confrontational. "I understand the safety concerns, Commander. But I wasn't asking to use your equipment irresponsibly. I was simply wondering if I might be allowed to demonstrate something that could potentially help your trainees." The request was so unexpected that several of the SEALs actually laughed out loud. The idea of a 70-something woman offering to demonstrate rope climbing techniques to Navy SEALs seemed absurd. "Look, lady," called out Seaman Rodriguez, a muscular young man who had failed the rope climb twice that morning. "No offense, but this isn't a senior citizen fitness class. This is SEAL training. We're dealing with equipment that would be dangerous for someone your age to even approach." Maggie turned her attention to Rodriguez, her expression patient but determined. "Young man, I appreciate your concern for my safety. But before you dismiss what someone can do based on their age, you might want to consider what you don't know about them." Commander Mitchell found himself in an unusual position. Protocol dictated that he should ask this civilian to move along and return to their training. But something about Maggie's confidence and her specific observations about their technique made him curious. "Ma'am, what exactly is your background with rope climbing?" he asked. Maggie straightened her shoulders. "I spent 30 years as a physical education teacher and athletic coach. I also competed in obstacle course racing well into my 60s. But, more importantly, I grew up on a working farm where rope climbing wasn't just exercise, it was a daily necessity." The information gave the SEALs pause. While they still found it hard to believe that this elderly woman could demonstrate anything they didn't already know, her background suggested she might have more experience than they initially thought. "I tell you what," Maggie continued, "I can see you're skeptical, and I understand why. But what if I could show you a technique that might help some of your trainees who are struggling? Would you be willing to give me just 5 minutes of your time?" Commander Mitchell looked at his watch. They had plenty of time left in their training session, and his men could use the extra rest. Part of him was curious to see what this confident woman had in mind, even if it ended up being a waste of time. "Ma'am, I have to tell you that our insurance and safety protocols don't allow civilians to use military training equipment." "I'm not asking to use your equipment," Maggie replied. "I'm asking if you have a basic rope that I could demonstrate with. Something lower and safer than your training rope." Petty Officer Chin spoke up. "Commander, we do have the practice rope that we use for beginners. It's only 8 feet high and has safety mats underneath." Commander Mitchell considered the request. The practice rope was indeed much safer, and if this woman wanted to embarrass herself trying to climb it, at least she wouldn't be seriously injured. His men might even learn something about humility in the process. "All right, ma'am, you can try the practice rope, but I want to be very clear about something. If you show any sign of difficulty or distress, this demonstration ends immediately, and you'll need to sign a waiver acknowledging that you're participating in this activity against our recommendation." Maggie nodded agreement. That's perfectly reasonable, Commander. As they walked toward the practice rope, word spread quickly among the SEALs about what was happening. Training came to an unofficial halt as more than 30 elite soldiers gathered around to watch an elderly woman attempt something that many of them found challenging even on their best days. The practice rope hung from a sturdy wooden framework, its thick fibers worn smooth from years of use. Safety mats surrounded the base, and the height, while not as intimidating as the main training rope, still presented a real challenge. Maggie removed her light jacket, revealing arms that, while showing her age, were clearly well-maintained through years of regular exercise. She approached the rope with the same calm confidence she had shown throughout the entire interaction. "Before I start," she said, addressing the gathered SEALs, "I want you to watch my foot positioning and how I coordinate my arm and leg movements. The key is creating a rhythm that allows your legs to support much of your weight, giving your arms regular moments of rest during the climb." She grasped the rope with both hands, positioning her feet in a way that looked different from the standard technique the SEALs had been taught. Instead of gripping the rope between her feet, she created a kind of stirrup with her legs that seemed to lock around the rope more securely. What happened next would be talked about in the SEAL training community for years to come. Maggie began her ascent with smooth, controlled movements that made the climb look almost effortless. Her rhythm was perfect, and, true to her word, she seemed to be using her legs to support her weight while her arms guided and steadied her progress. She reached the top of the 8-foot rope in less than 30 seconds, touched the wooden beam, and descended with the same controlled grace. When her feet touched the safety mat, the beach was completely silent. 30 of America's most elite warriors stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Commander Mitchell was the first to find his voice. "Ma'am, that was quite impressive. Your technique is indeed different from what we teach." Maggie dusted off her hands and smiled. "Thank you, Commander. As I mentioned, sometimes experience and proper technique can compensate for what people assume are physical limitations." Seaman Rodriguez, who had been the most vocal skeptic, stepped forward. I have to admit, ma'am, that looked a lot easier when you did it. Could you show us exactly how you position your feet?" The question opened the floodgates. Suddenly, a dozen SEALs were asking questions about her technique, her training background, and how she had made the climb look so effortless. But Maggie had one more surprise for them. "I appreciate all the questions," she said, "but I should mention that the 8-foot rope is nice for demonstration purposes. However, I couldn't help but notice that several of you were having trouble with the 20-foot rope over there." She gestured toward the main training obstacle that had been challenging the SEALs all morning. "Now, I know what you're thinking," she continued. "The height difference makes it a completely different challenge. But the technique remains the same, and, with proper pacing, the height becomes less relevant than you might expect." Commander Mitchell felt his jaw drop. "Ma'am, you're not suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything, Commander," Maggie replied with that same confident smile. "I'm asking the same question I asked when I first approached your group." She paused for effect, looking directly at each of the young faces surrounding her. "Can I try next?" The silence that followed Maggie's question seemed to stretch forever. Commander Mitchell found himself in completely uncharted territory. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The insurance implications alone should have made his decision automatic, but something about this remarkable woman made him hesitate. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "that 20-foot rope represents one of our most challenging physical tests. We've had experienced SEALs fail that climb multiple times before succeeding. The physical demands are exponentially greater than what you just demonstrated." Maggie nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concerns, Commander. But consider this. You've just seen that my technique works effectively on the shorter rope. The physical principles don't change with height, only the endurance required. And endurance, I can assure you, is something I've spent decades building." Petty Officer Chin stepped closer to her commanding officer. "Sir, what she accomplished just now was genuinely impressive. Her technique is actually superior to what some of our trainees use. Maybe we should hear her out." The other SEALs began murmuring among themselves. Some were clearly skeptical that anyone her age could handle the main rope climb, while others seemed genuinely curious about what this unexpected teacher might show them. Seaman Martinez, who had successfully completed the 20-foot climb earlier but, with great difficulty, spoke up. Ma'am, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that main rope climb isn't just about technique. It's about raw strength and endurance. Even with perfect form, you need significant upper body power to make it to the top. Maggie turned to face Martinez directly. You're absolutely right that strength is important. But let me ask you something. When you completed the climb earlier, how did you feel at the top? Martinez thought for a moment. Honestly, completely exhausted. My arms were burning, and I barely made it. And how long did it take you? About 2 minutes, maybe a little more. Maggie smiled. That's exactly what I expected. You were fighting the rope instead of working with it. Your technique, while eventually successful, was inefficient. You burned through your strength reserves too quickly. She gestured toward the imposing 20-foot rope that swayed gently in the ocean breeze. With proper technique, that climb should take about 90 seconds and leave you tired but not completely drained. Commander Mitchell found himself genuinely intrigued despite his reservations. Ma'am, even if your technique is more efficient, the physical demands of a 20-foot rope climb are substantial. At your age, Commander, Maggie interrupted gently, I appreciate your concern for my well-being. But before you make assumptions about what my age means for my capabilities, perhaps you'd like to know a bit more about my background. She settled onto one of the equipment crates, clearly preparing to share something significant. The SEALs gathered closer, their training session temporarily forgotten. I mentioned that I was a physical education teacher for 30 years, she began. What I didn't mention is that I specialized in adaptive athletics. I worked with students who had been told they couldn't do things because of their age, size, disabilities, or other limitations. My job was to prove those assumptions wrong. Petty Officer Chin sat down on the sand nearby. What kind of adaptive athletics? All kinds. I had students in wheelchairs competing in modified obstacle courses. Elderly students learning rock climbing. Students with various physical challenges completing activities that their doctors said were impossible. Maggie's voice carried the passion of someone who had found her true calling in life. But, more relevant to today, she continued, I also competed personally in obstacle course racing from age 50 to 68. I held several age group records, and regularly outperformed competitors half my age. Seaman Rodriguez whistled softly. Age 68. Ma'am, that's incredible. Thank you. But it's not incredible. It's simply what happens when you understand that age is often a limitation we place on ourselves rather than a real physical barrier. Maggie stood up, her posture straight and confident. I stopped competing not because I couldn't continue, but because I wanted to focus my energy on teaching others. Commander Mitchell was beginning to understand that this was no ordinary senior citizen making an unrealistic request. Ma'am, what you're describing is genuinely impressive. But obstacle course racing, even at an elite level, is different from military-grade training equipment. You're absolutely right, Maggie agreed. Military equipment is designed to test the absolute limits of human capability. But that's exactly why proper technique becomes even more important. When the margin for error is smaller, efficiency isn't just helpful, it's essential. She walked over to the base of the 20-foot rope and looked up at the top. I spent 3 years studying the biomechanics of rope climbing after watching too many of my students struggle with it. I worked with physical therapists, analyzed slow-motion videos, and tested different approaches until I developed what I believe is the most efficient technique possible. Seaman Martinez joined her at the base of the rope. What makes your technique so different? Maggie began explaining as she demonstrated the positioning with her hands and feet on the rope. Most people, including many military trainees, rely too heavily on their arms and shoulders. They pull themselves up primarily with their upper body strength. My technique distributes the work more evenly across your entire body. She showed them how she positioned her feet to create what she called a moving platform that supported her weight while her arms guided and steadied her movement. The key is creating a rhythm where your legs are doing much of the lifting while your arms focus on balance and control. Several of the SEALs tried mimicking her positioning on the rope without climbing. Even standing on the ground, they could feel how her technique engaged different muscle groups than their standard approach. This is actually fascinating, Petty Officer Chin observed. The way you're distributing the load would definitely be more sustainable over a longer climb. Commander Mitchell watched his team's growing interest with mixed feelings. As their instructor, he was always looking for ways to improve their performance and reduce unnecessary strain during training. But, as their commanding officer, he remained concerned about the safety and liability issues of allowing a civilian to attempt their most challenging obstacle. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I can see that your technique has merit, and my team is learning from your explanations. But I'm still not comfortable with you attempting the full rope climb. The risk factors are simply too high." Maggie turned to face him, her expression serious but understanding. "Commander, I respect your position and your responsibility for safety. But let me propose a compromise that might address your concerns while still allowing me to demonstrate the full technique. I'm listening. What if we set up additional safety measures? Extra mats, spotters, whatever you think is necessary. And what if I agree to attempt only a partial climb initially? Say, 10 feet, just to show that the technique works at height." Commander Mitchell considered the proposal. A 10-foot climb would still be impressive and would demonstrate whether her technique truly worked under real conditions, but it would be significantly safer than the full 20-foot challenge. Before he could respond, Seaman Rodriguez spoke up. "Sir, if she's willing to start with a partial climb, and if we can set up proper safety measures, it might be worth seeing. I mean, if her technique really is more efficient, it could help all of us improve our performance." Other members of the team began voicing similar thoughts. They had been genuinely impressed by her demonstration on the practice rope, and her explanations of technique were more sophisticated than many they had heard from official instructors. "Besides," added Seaman Martinez, "if her technique doesn't work at height, she'll discover that pretty quickly, and we can end the demonstration safely." Commander Mitchell looked around at his team. Their enthusiasm was evident, and he had to admit that their reasoning made sense. If this woman's technique really could help improve their performance, he would be doing them a disservice by not allowing the demonstration. "All right," he said finally. "We'll set up additional safety measures, and you can attempt a 10-foot climb. But I want it clearly understood that if I see any sign of difficulty or distress, the demonstration ends immediately." "Absolutely," Maggie agreed. "That's completely reasonable." The next 20 minutes were spent arranging additional safety equipment around the rope. Extra mats were positioned, and several SEALs were assigned as spotters. Commander Mitchell also insisted that the base medic be present and ready to respond if needed. During the preparation time, word had somehow spread to other training groups in the area. By the time everything was ready, nearly 50 Navy SEALs had gathered to watch what many of them assumed would be an embarrassing failure by an overconfident civilian. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams, the senior enlisted advisor for the training facility, arrived just as the final safety preparations were being completed. He immediately sought out Commander Mitchell. "Jake, what the hell is going on here? I heard there's a civilian attempting to use our training equipment." Commander Mitchell quickly explained the situation, emphasizing the safety measures they had put in place and the woman's apparently extensive background in physical fitness and obstacle training. Master Chief Williams looked skeptical. "You're telling me a 70-year-old grandmother convinced you to let her attempt a rope climb that gives our SEALs trouble?" "I know how it sounds, Master Chief. But her demonstration on the practice rope was genuinely impressive, and her technical knowledge is exceptional. If nothing else, my team is learning from her explanations." Williams walked over to observe Maggie, who was doing final stretches and preparing for her attempt. Even his experienced eye had to admit that she moved with the confidence and body awareness of a trained athlete. "Ma'am," he called out, "I understand you're planning to attempt our rope climb." Maggie straightened up and smiled. "That's correct. Though we've agreed to start with just a 10-foot climb for safety purposes. I appreciate the safety precautions. But I have to ask, do you understand what you're attempting? This isn't a gym rope or recreational equipment. This is designed to test the limits of elite military personnel." "I understand completely," Maggie replied. "And I respect the level of challenge it represents. That's exactly why I believe proper technique is so crucial. When the margin for error is small, efficiency becomes everything." Master Chief Williams nodded slowly. He had spent 30 years in the Navy and had learned to recognize genuine confidence versus false bravado. This woman displayed the former. "Well, ma'am, you certainly seem to know what you're about. I guess we'll see what you can do." Maggie approached the base of the rope one final time, testing her grip and reviewing her foot positioning. The crowd of seals had grown quiet, their earlier amusement replaced by genuine curiosity and, in some cases, nervous anticipation. "Before I start," she announced, "I want everyone to watch carefully. This isn't about proving that age doesn't matter. It's about demonstrating that proper technique can make seemingly impossible challenges manageable." She grasped the rope with both hands and positioned her feet in the distinctive pattern she had shown them earlier. "Remember, watch the rhythm and how my legs are supporting the weight while my arms control the movement." Commander Mitchell stepped closer, ready to call off the attempt at the first sign of trouble. "Ma'am, whenever you're ready." Maggie took a deep breath, looked up toward her 10-foot target, and smiled. "Can I try next?" she said quietly, almost to herself. And then she began to climb. The moment Maggie began her ascent, everything changed. The casual conversation and nervous energy that had filled the air disappeared, replaced by focused attention from every person on the beach. What the assembled seals witnessed in the next 90 seconds would challenge everything they thought they knew about physical limitations and human potential. Maggie's movement up the rope was unlike anything they had seen before. Where other climbers fought against the rope, she seemed to dance with it. Her rhythm was hypnotic, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. Her legs worked in perfect coordination with her arms, creating a mechanical efficiency that made the climb appear effortless. At the 5-foot mark, she paused briefly, not from exhaustion but to demonstrate a key aspect of her technique. "Notice how my legs are locked in position, supporting my full weight while my arms rest," she called down to the watching seals. Her breathing was steady, showing no signs of strain. Commander Mitchell found himself unconsciously holding his breath. He had expected to see struggle, effort, maybe even failure. Instead, he was watching what looked more like a textbook demonstration than a physical challenge. Maggie resumed her climb with the same smooth rhythm. At 8 feet, she called down again. "Watch how I adjust my foot position as I get higher." The technique adapts to maintain efficiency. When she reached the 10-foot mark, she touched the designated point on the rope and paused. Looking down at the crowd of stunned faces, she smiled and said, "That's 10 feet, as we agreed. Shall I come down now?" The beach erupted in spontaneous applause and cheering. Even the most skeptical seals found themselves clapping for what they had just witnessed. Master Chief Williams stood with his mouth slightly open, trying to process what he had seen. But Maggie wasn't finished with her surprises. Instead of beginning her descent immediately, she called down to Commander Mitchell. "Sir, I know we agreed on 10 feet for safety purposes, but I have to tell you, I feel completely strong and stable up here. Would you be willing to let me continue to the top?" The request sent a murmur through the crowd. Commander Mitchell looked up at her, trying to assess her condition. She showed no signs of fatigue. Her voice was clear and steady, and her positioning on the rope appeared completely secure. "Ma'am, how do you feel?" "Honestly, like I could do this 3 more times," she replied with a laugh. "This technique really does work, Commander. I'd love to show your team the complete demonstration." Master Chief Williams stepped forward. "Commander, she's clearly in control up there. And, frankly, I think we all want to see if she can actually pull this off." Commander Mitchell looked around at his team. Their faces showed a mixture of amazement, curiosity, and anticipation. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to pushing physical boundaries, and they were witnessing something extraordinary. "All right, ma'am," he called up. "If you're certain you can do it safely, proceed to the top. But I want you to talk to us during the climb. If your breathing becomes labored or you feel any distress, we're bringing you down immediately." "Understood, Commander. Thank you for trusting me." What happened next would become legendary in SEAL training circles. Maggie resumed her climb with the same steady rhythm she had maintained from the beginning. Her commentary continued as she ascended, turning the climb into an impromptu teaching session. "Notice how my breathing stays controlled," she called down as she passed the 12-foot mark. "When you're fighting the rope, you burn oxygen quickly. When you work with it, your breathing can stay almost normal." At 15 feet, she demonstrated another aspect of her technique. At this height, mental focus becomes as important as physical technique. Some people panic when they get this high, but if you trust your method and maintain your rhythm, height becomes irrelevant. Seaman Rodriguez found himself taking mental notes. He had struggled with the mental aspect of high rope climbs, often losing his technique due to nervousness as he got higher. At 18 feet, just 2 feet from the top, Maggie paused again. "This is where most climbers make their biggest mistake," she announced. "They try to rush the final few feet because they can see the top. But that's when your technique breaks down and you waste the most energy." She demonstrated her point by maintaining her exact rhythm for the final 2 feet, touching the top beam with the same controlled movement she had used throughout the entire climb. The moment her hand touched the 20-foot mark, the beach exploded in cheers. SEALs were shouting, whistling, and applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Even Master Chief Williams found himself clapping enthusiastically. But Maggie had one more lesson to teach. "Now watch the descent," she called down. "This is actually where proper technique becomes most important. A bad descent can be dangerous, and it can also waste all the energy you saved during the climb." Her descent was as controlled and purposeful as her ascent had been. She demonstrated how to use the rope to control speed while maintaining safety, and how to position your body to reduce strain on your arms and hands. When her feet finally touched the safety mats, the applause became thunderous. SEALs who had been skeptical an hour earlier were now rushing forward to shake her hand and ask questions about her technique. Commander Mitchell was among the first to reach her. "Ma'am, that was absolutely incredible. I've been training SEALs for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just demonstrated." Maggie smiled, slightly out of breath, but clearly energized by the accomplishment. "Thank you, Commander. But remember, this isn't about what one person can do. This is about what anyone can accomplish with proper technique and preparation." Petty Officer Chin appeared at Maggie's side with a water bottle. "Ma'am, would you be willing to teach us your technique? I mean, really teach it step by step?" "I would be honored to," Maggie replied. "That's why I asked to try in the first place. I've spent years developing and refining this approach specifically so I could share it with others." Seaman Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how long did that take you? It felt like you were up there for 10 minutes, but it couldn't have been." Commander Mitchell checked his stopwatch. 93 seconds from bottom to top. That's faster than our current facility record for that rope. A collective gasp went up from the assembled SEALs. The facility record had been set by a 25-year-old SEAL in peak physical condition. The fact that a 72-year-old woman had not only completed the climb but had broken the existing record was almost too much to process. Master Chief Williams approached Maggie with a look of deep respect. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. When I first heard about this situation, I assumed it was some kind of publicity stunt or misguided attempt by a civilian to prove a point. I was wrong. No apology necessary, Master Chief. Your skepticism was completely reasonable. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I'm glad I was able to provide that evidence. What you did today," Williams continued, "isn't just impressive on a personal level. You've demonstrated a technique that could genuinely improve the performance and safety of our trainees. Would you be interested in sharing your knowledge with our training program on a more formal basis?" The question surprised everyone, including Maggie. The idea of a civilian consultant working with Navy SEAL training was almost unprecedented. "I would be very interested in that opportunity," she replied. "I believe this technique could help reduce training injuries while improving performance. That sounds like something worth pursuing." Commander Mitchell nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, we're going to need to go through proper channels and get approvals from higher up the chain of command. But I can tell you that I'll be recommending this strongly. What you've shown us today could benefit thousands of future SEALs." As the crowd began to disperse and the normal training schedule resumed, small groups of SEALs surrounded Maggie, eager to learn more about her techniques and her background. The morning that had started as a routine training session had turned into something none of them would ever forget. Seaman Rodriguez, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics, approached Maggie as she was preparing to leave. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for my comments earlier. I made assumptions about what you could do based on your age, and I was completely wrong." Maggie placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Young man, your skepticism wasn't wrong or offensive. It was natural. Most people in your position would have reacted the same way. The important thing is that you were willing to change your mind when presented with new evidence. Would you really be willing to teach us your technique? I mean, spend time actually training us. Absolutely. In fact, I'd like to propose something to your commander. What if we set up a series of training sessions where I can work with small groups to teach this technique properly? It's not something you can master from one demonstration. Rodriguez's face lit up. That would be incredible. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? Of course. What made you want to do this? I mean, you could have just watched our training and gone on with your run. Why did you feel the need to prove yourself to a bunch of young SEALs? Maggie considered the question carefully before responding. Rodriguez, it wasn't about proving myself. It was about proving what's possible. Too often, people accept limitations that aren't real. Age, size, background, whatever. They assume they can't do something without ever really trying. She gestured toward the rope that had been the scene of her triumph. I've spent my entire career trying to show people that most limitations are mental, not physical. When I saw your team struggling with something I knew I could help with, I couldn't just walk away. But weren't you nervous? I mean, attempting something like that in front of all of us. Maggie laughed, terrified. But fear of failure isn't a good reason not to try something you believe you can accomplish. The worst thing that could have happened was that I would fail and learn something in the process. And the best thing that could happen? Exactly what did happen. A group of exceptional people learned that they might be capable of more than they thought. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember that the next time they face a challenge that seems impossible. As Maggie finally prepared to leave the training area, Commander Mitchell approached her one more time. Ma'am, I need to ask you one final question. Certainly, Commander. When you first approached us this morning and asked about the rope climb, did you already know you were going to end up attempting it yourself? Maggie's eyes twinkled with mischief. Commander, I've been watching SEAL training from this beach for 3 years, every Tuesday and Thursday during my morning runs. I've seen hundreds of young people struggle with that rope climb using inefficient technique. And for 3 years, I've been wanting to ask the same question I asked today, which was, can I try next? With that, Margaret Thompson walked back to her pickup truck, leaving behind a group of Navy SEALs who would never again make assumptions about what people could accomplish based on their age, size, or appearance. But her story with the SEALs was far from over. In fact, the most remarkable chapters were yet to be written. 3 weeks later, Maggie received a phone call that would change not only her life, but the future of Navy SEAL training itself. Commander Mitchell's voice was excited as he spoke into the phone from his office at the Naval Special Warfare Command. Mrs. Thompson, I have some remarkable news. The training command has approved a pilot program based on your rope climbing technique. They want to offer you a formal consulting position with our training facility. Maggie sat down heavily in her favorite armchair, temporarily speechless. She had hoped that her demonstration might help a few individual SEALs improve their technique, but she never imagined it would lead to an official position with the Navy. Commander, are you serious? They want me to work with the SEAL training program. Completely serious, ma'am. Your demonstration created quite a stir up the chain of command. When Master Chief Williams submitted his report, it caught the attention of some very high-ranking officers. They're interested in implementing your techniques not just locally, but potentially across all SEAL training facilities. The conversation continued for an hour as Commander Mitchell explained the details of the proposed program. Maggie would work 3 days per week at the Coronado facility, developing a formal curriculum around her rope climbing technique and training instructors who could teach it to others. But the Navy's interest went beyond just rope climbing. They wanted her to analyze other aspects of their physical training program, looking for ways to improve efficiency and reduce injury rates. Her background in adaptive athletics and her fresh perspective on traditional training methods had impressed the military leadership. 2 months later, Maggie found herself standing in front of a classroom full of Navy SEAL instructors, preparing to deliver her first formal training session. The irony wasn't lost on her that these elite military trainers were now her students. Gentlemen, she began. 3 months ago, most of you would have laughed at the idea of learning rope climbing technique from a 72-year-old woman. Today, you're here because you've seen that age and experience can sometimes offer insights that youth and strength cannot. The response from the instructors exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only did they embrace Maggie's techniques, but they began bringing her other training challenges they had been struggling with. Her analytical approach and decades of experience working with people of all physical capabilities made her uniquely qualified to find solutions. Within 6 months, injury rates in rope climbing training had dropped by 40%, while completion rates had improved by 25%. The technique that Maggie had perfected through years of personal experimentation was proving its value on a much larger scale. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitudes of the SEAL trainees themselves. The story of Maggie's challenge and success had spread throughout the military community, becoming a powerful example of how assumptions about human limitations can be wrong. Seaman Rodriguez, who had been one of Maggie's most vocal skeptics on that first morning, became one of her most enthusiastic students. He mastered her rope climbing technique and went on to set a new facility record, completing the 20-foot climb in 84 seconds. "Mrs. Thompson," he told her after breaking the record, "what you taught me goes way beyond rope climbing. You taught me not to accept limitations without testing them first." Petty Officer Chun took the lessons even further. She began applying Maggie's principles to other aspects of SEAL training, looking for ways to work smarter rather than just harder. Her innovations in obstacle course training led to her being assigned to the training development team. But the impact of Maggie's work extended far beyond the immediate training improvements. Word of her success reached other military training facilities, and soon she was consulting with Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and even International Special Forces units. A year after her first rope climb demonstration, Maggie was invited to speak at an international military training conference. Her presentation, titled "Redefining Physical Limitations," drew standing ovations from military leaders around the world. "The lesson here isn't about age," she told the audience of hundreds of military professionals. "It's about the danger of accepting limitations without testing them. Every day, we make assumptions about what's possible based on incomplete information. Sometimes, the biggest barrier to achievement isn't physical ability, it's mental acceptance of supposed limitations." The conference led to invitations from civilian organizations as well. Corporate training programs, athletic teams, and educational institutions wanted to learn from the woman who had challenged one of the world's most elite military training programs and won. But Maggie remained focused on her work with the SEALs. The relationships she had built with the trainees and instructors had become deeply meaningful to her. Many of the young SEALs had begun seeking her advice on challenges that went far beyond physical training. Rodriguez, now a petty officer himself, often visited Maggie during his off-duty hours. Their conversations covered everything from career decisions to personal relationships, and Maggie found herself becoming an unofficial mentor to dozens of young military personnel. "You know what the most important thing you taught me was?" he asked her one afternoon as they sat on the beach watching a new group of trainees attempt the rope climb. "I'm not sure." "What?" "That wisdom and experience matter. In our culture, we're so focused on youth and physical strength that we sometimes forget that there are other kinds of power. You showed us that knowledge and technique can be just as valuable as muscle and speed." Maggie smiled as she watched a young trainee successfully complete the rope climb using her technique. "Rodriguez, that works both ways. You and your colleagues taught me that it's never too late to take on new challenges. At 72, I thought my days of making a significant professional contribution were behind me. And now I realize that some of our most important contributions might come when we least expect them." 2 years after her first demonstration, the Navy formally adopted Maggie's rope climbing technique as the standard method taught to all SEAL trainees. The Thompson technique, as it became known, was included in official training manuals and became part of the curriculum at every naval special warfare training facility. But Maggie's influence extended far beyond rope climbing. Her success had opened doors for other civilian experts to contribute to military training. Physical therapists, sports scientists, and specialized athletic coaches began working more closely with military training programs, bringing fresh perspectives to age-old challenges. The cultural impact was perhaps even more significant than the technical improvements. The story of Maggie's challenge had become part of SEAL folklore, a reminder that excellence could come from unexpected sources and that assumptions about human limitations should always be questioned. Master Chief Williams, who had initially been skeptical of allowing a civilian to attempt SEAL training equipment, became one of Maggie's strongest advocates. He often told new trainees about her demonstration as part of his orientation lectures. "The lesson isn't that age doesn't matter," he would explain. "The lesson is that we often underestimate what people are capable of when they combine proper technique with determination and preparation." Mrs. Thompson didn't succeed because she was special. She succeeded because she had spent decades preparing for that moment, even though she didn't know it at the time. On the third anniversary of her first rope climb, the Naval Special Warfare Command held a ceremony in Maggie's honor. She was presented with a special recognition award for her contributions to SEAL training, making her the first civilian to receive such an honor. Commander Mitchell, who had since been promoted to executive officer, gave the presentation speech. 3 years ago, Mrs. Thompson asked a simple question that changed everything. "Can I try next?" Today, we're here to recognize that her willingness to try, to challenge assumptions, and to share her knowledge has made every one of our trainees safer and more effective. During her acceptance speech, Maggie reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple morning run on the beach. "When I approached that group of young SEALs 3 years ago, I wasn't trying to prove anything about myself. I was trying to prove something about human potential. We all have capabilities that we haven't discovered yet, techniques we haven't tried, and challenges we haven't attempted." She looked out at the audience of military personnel, many of whom she had trained personally over the past 3 years. The question, "Can I try next?" isn't really about seeking permission. It's about refusing to accept that something is impossible without testing it first. It's about believing that experience and wisdom have value, regardless of where they come from. The ceremony concluded with something that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier: a 75-year-old grandmother leading a group of Navy SEALs in a demonstration of rope climbing technique. As Maggie climbed the rope one more time, moving with the same smooth efficiency that had amazed everyone that first morning, the assembled military personnel cheered not just for her individual achievement, but for what she represented. She had proven that excellence comes in many forms, that wisdom and experience are as valuable as youth and strength, and that the willingness to try can overcome almost any obstacle. When she reached the top of the rope and looked down at the cheering crowd, Maggie thought about all the young people whose lives had been touched by her unexpected journey. Hundreds of SEALs had learned her techniques. Thousands more would learn them in the future, and the principles she had demonstrated would continue to influence military training for generations to come. But, perhaps more importantly, her story had become a reminder that it's never too late to make a difference, never too late to challenge assumptions, and never too late to ask the most important question in human development: "Can I try next?" As she began her descent, moving with the same controlled grace that had started everything 3 years earlier, Maggie smiled at the thought that the best chapters of her life had begun when most people her age were settling into retirement. The rope climb that had started as a simple demonstration had become a legacy of courage, determination, and the power of refusing to accept limitations without testing them first. And somewhere on a beach in Coronado, a new group of young SEALs was learning that greatness can come from the most unexpected places, if you're willing to give it a chance. The question, "Can I try next?" had changed everything. And it would continue to inspire people to challenge their assumptions about what's possible for years to come. Margaret Thompson had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply ask for the chance to show what you're capable of. The Navy SEALs had initially mocked her request, but they ended up learning that wisdom, experience, and the courage to try can be just as powerful as youth and strength. Her legacy would live on in every rope climb completed using her technique, in every trainee who learned not to accept limitations without testing them first, and in every person who heard her story and decided to ask their own version of the question that started it all: "Can I try next?"